Hello Raptors fans, and welcome back to Raptors Report. With the offseason winding down and preseason just around the corner, we're going to do one final look at the Toronto Raptors offseason, and perhaps do a little bit of prognosticating on top of that. Without further ado, let's jump in. In last week's episode, we looked at two of the biggest events in the Toronto Raptors offseason, the NBA draft and the Kyle Lowry trade. This week, we'll be looking at the Raptors' surprising free agency, followed by a quick evaluation of where I believe the team is at, what I expect from the coming season, and some additional storylines that you might want to keep an eye on as the season develops. First off, let's take a look at free agency. A few months ago, I created a video describing some of the moves the Raptors could make in free agency. And other than re-signing their own free agents, I didn't manage to predict a single move because, well, the Raptors didn't make any. Okay, they made some moves in free agency, but as for going after any big-name free agents or frankly medium-name free agents, well, they just didn't. It's hard to give a good grade to a team that decided to forego making any major moves in free agency to improve the team. Blake Murphy, prior to his exit at The Athletic, wrote a piece with Eric Koreen about the Raptors' free agency woes. The general thrust behind the piece was that the Raptors haven't had a very good track record in free agency and have made a lot of their best moves either via the draft or through trades. As a result, they've decided to largely ignore free agency. While I understand that the Raptors front office recognize their own weaknesses and are reluctant to use this avenue to add talent to the team, I don't think that that is necessarily commendable or even good. I've heard some people that I respect mention that this free agency class was overpaid, and that teams who sat out could be saving themselves some cap-related headaches. I'm willing to buy that to a certain extent, although there were some bargains to be had in my opinion. Richaun Holmes, one of the players I suggested the Raptors look at, signed a 4-year, $13 million per season contract, which to me appears to be great value at a position of need. I get the feeling that the Raptors believe that they have a Richaun Holmes type prospect already on the roster in Precious Achiuwa, and only time will tell if that ends up being the case. It could also be the reluctance to hand over big bucks to a defense-first big with a more traditional offensive skill set. In terms of moves they did manage to make, I mentioned that I would be relatively happy with a $15 to $18 million contract for Gary Trent Jr. And while he's making a figure I said I'd be comfortable with, the final year of his contract is a player option, which is all downside for the Raptors. If he exceeds his value, he'll decline his third year, and if he performs below his contract, the Raptors will be on the hook for $18 million. There are two things I'd like to see from Gary Trent Jr. this season. One being attacking the basket more often, and the second is playing hard defense. Last season with the Raptors, Gary shot under 10% of his shots at the rim, and shot under 2 free throws despite taking almost 16 shots per game. When you're creating and taking a lot of jumpers and not driving to the rim, you aren't going to be very consistent. When the threes go in, you're going to look great, and when they don't, you'll kind of look like a chucker. I've covered his defense in the past, but I think this is an area that he can improve on, and I don't see why he can't. He needs to be more mentally engaged on staying with his man and making correct rotations, but that's something that should be easy to improve on if he's committed enough. Khem Birch is another player that the Raptors re-signed this offseason. As I mentioned in other videos, I like Birch, and I think he's a smart player who does a lot of things that you want from an NBA center. And he can execute the Raptors' offensive and especially defensive schemes very capably. The only issue I have with this deal is that I think that Birch is more of a very good backup than a starting center. The Raptors wrapped up the offseason, as far as I can tell, by handing out a bunch of training camp deals and adding Svi Mykhailiuk. I won't go into the other deals this episode, but I will talk about Svi. The Raptors gave Svi a 2-year, $3.6 million deal with a player option in the second year. Svi was drafted by the Lakers and then traded to the Detroit Pistons. His second year with them was pretty impressive. As an occasional starter, he managed to score 9 points per game and shoot 40% from 3. Last year, after some struggles, the Pistons dealt him mid-season to the Oklahoma City Thunder, where he posted more points per game, but his efficiency numbers weren't great. The thing that I like about this fee signing is that the Raptors appear to have learned from their mistakes. 2 seasons ago, they brought in Matt Thomas, who could shoot the leather off the ball but was a liability on defense due to his size. Nurse gave him a bit of rope at the beginning of last season, but then quickly removed him from the rotation, citing his small stature as one of the reasons he wasn't seeing any floor time. At 6'7", Svi can fit into more lineups with the Raptors, and while his defense isn't great, he's not going to be targeted by opposing offenses in the same way as Thomas was. This signing really comes down to efficiency. If he can return to being a 40-ish% three-point shooter, then this will be a great value signing, even with the player option. If not, it's not really that bad of a gamble as he's only making the minimum. Shooters will always have a place on an NBA roster, so if the Raptors landed one, I'll be very pleased. Now we come to the last part of this episode, which will be devoted to discussing the Raptors roster as a whole. I made a bold prediction near the end of last season, where I said that the Raptors would return to contention as soon as next year. As it stands, I will have to reevaluate that position, as the moves they made in the draft and free agency point towards a building year rather than a competing year. Part of the reason I'm a little down on the Raptors' lack of movement in free agency is that they didn't really add any immediate help to last year's roster, and while I believe that there will be growth, I think that running things back will put the Raptors in the middle of the road in the Eastern Conference. Another big setback for the Raptors in terms of competing will be Pascal Siakam's absence at the beginning of the season due to shoulder surgery, and his return date is pegged at November the 11th. With him scheduled to miss 10-ish games and likely a bit of rust to shake off, that might put the Raptors in an early hole. As a team, I expect the Raptors to be good defensively, especially with a competent center. I think that they will struggle to find consistency on the offensive end due to their over-reliance on three-point shooting, and we will again see the long scoring droughts that plagued the Raptors last season. I think they'll probably be better rebounding-wise, as they won't be so reliant on smaller lineups and zone defenses. I think last season's health woes were an aberration, and we'll see more consistent lineups and continuity. I also think the Raptors will benefit mightily from playing at Scotiabank Center and having access to the amenities the city of Toronto offers, which was a constant refrain from players last season in Tampa. I'm not going to put a fine point on the Raptors' record next season, but I foresee the Raptors finishing anywhere from 6th to 10th. I kind of have them penciled into the play-in tournament next season, probably finishing a few games within 500 in either direction. One big thing to watch will be OG Anunoby's development as a scorer. If he takes another big step, it could drastically accelerate the Raptors' contention timeframe. Overall, I'm excited to see how everything shakes out. And that's the offseason roundup. Thanks for your patience as I navigate a busy time in my personal life, and I'm glad you've stuck with the channel. Follow me on Twitter for daily Raptors and NBA tweets, and remember to follow and like the video if you haven't already. As always, thanks for tuning in to Raptors Report, your source for in-depth Raptors content.